JD Vance just called Europe defenseless, not fragile, not underprepared, not in need of reform, defenseless. The Vice President of the United States stood before cameras and declared, without hesitation and without apology, that Europe, the continent home to some of the world's largest economies and most sophisticated military powers, cannot defend itself, that it is, in his word, defenseless against the threats it faces. And he said it in a way that made absolutely clear this was not a slip of the tongue. This was not a misquote. This was a calculated, deliberate, fully intentional statement from the second most powerful man in the American government. The reaction from NATO has been unlike anything seen in the alliance's 75-year history. Senior officials who have spent entire careers speaking in careful, measured diplomatic language are tonight using words they have never used before. Words like betrayal, words like rupture. One senior NATO diplomat, speaking without attribution because they were not authorized to go this far publicly, said, and we are quoting directly here, "This is the day the alliance changed forever." Think about that, forever. In the next few minutes, we are going to tell you exactly what Vance said, why he said it, what it means for every nation sheltering under NATO's umbrella, and what happens next in a world where the American vice president has just told Europe it cannot protect itself. Do not go anywhere. This story is moving, and every minute matters. Context matters enormously here, because where JD Vance made this statement is almost as significant as what he said. Vance was not speaking at a private briefing. He was not caught on a hot microphone at a closed-door meeting. He made these remarks in a formal public setting before an audience that included European leaders, senior defense officials, and international media. He chose this moment. He chose this stage. And he chose these words with full knowledge of who was listening and what the consequences would be. According to multiple accounts from officials and journalists present, Vance argued that European nations have systematically failed to invest in their own defense capabilities to a degree that has left the continent genuinely vulnerable, not just theoretically underprepared, but actually incapable of mounting an effective independent defense against a serious military threat. He described the current state of European military capacity as a structural failure decades in the making, the predictable result, he argued, of nations choosing to spend on social programs and domestic priorities while relying on American military power as a permanent, unconditional backstop. He used the word defenseless, not once, but multiple times. And each time, he doubled down rather than softened, making it unmistakably clear that the choice of language was intentional. He was not reaching for a diplomatic bridge. He was burning one. What makes this even more extraordinary is the specific claim embedded in the word itself. Europe is not, by any objective military measure, a continent without defenses. France possesses nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom maintains a significant, independent military force. Germany has been rapidly increasing its defense spending since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Poland has one of the largest standing armies in Europe and has been on a military buildup trajectory that defense analysts have described as remarkable in its speed and scale. For the American vice president to look at all of that and say defenseless is not an assessment, it is a provocation. And Europe knows it. To understand why this particular word landed with the force that it did, you need to understand what defenseless means to the nations of Europe, not just militarily, but historically and emotionally. Europe was genuinely defenseless once. It was defenseless in 1939, when German tanks rolled across borders while the rest of the continent scrambled to respond too slowly and too late. It was defenseless in ways that produced the Holocaust, the firebombing of civilian cities, and a death toll of over 70 million human beings. The entire post-war architecture, NATO, the American security guarantee, the permanent stationing of U.S. troops on European soil, was built specifically and explicitly so that Europe would never be defenseless again. When JD Vance uses that word, he is not just making a military assessment. Consciously or not, he is invoking the deepest trauma in modern European history. He is telling a continent that has spent 80 years building institutions precisely to avoid vulnerability that all of that effort has failed, that despite everything, Europe remains what it was before the war, exposed, inadequate, and dependent. That is why the reaction from European leaders has not simply been political. It has been visceral. It has carried an emotional weight that goes far beyond a typical policy disagreement between allies. You do not call Europe defenseless and expect a calm, measured response. You call Europe defenseless, and you get exactly what you are getting right now: fury, fear, and a recalibration of trust that will not be easily reversed. Senior German defense officials, speaking to German national media, described Vance's remarks as historically illiterate and strategically reckless. That phrase, coming from German officials about an American vice president, is so far outside the normal range of transatlantic diplomatic discourse that it is worth pausing on. Germany, which has been the most careful and restrained of all European nations in its public statements about the Trump administration's NATO positions, has now crossed a line. When Berlin starts using language like that, the temperature of this crisis has reached a genuinely new level. NATO's official response came within hours, and it was notable both for what it said and for what it could not quite bring itself to say. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte issued a statement that, in the careful language of international diplomacy, amounted to a direct rebuttal of Vance's characterization. Rutte cited specific data points: defense spending increases across member states, expanded force deployments on NATO's eastern flank, new capability investments in air defense, cyber warfare, and long-range strike systems, to argue that the picture Vance painted bears no resemblance to the military reality on the ground. He did not use the word wrong. Diplomatic convention does not permit a secretary general to call the American vice president wrong. But the substance of his statement said exactly that. Behind the official response, however, the real reaction was significantly more raw. Alliance sources describe emergency consultations being held across multiple NATO capitals simultaneously, not to coordinate a public message, but to answer a more fundamental question: what does it mean for the alliance going forward if the second-ranking official of its most powerful member genuinely believes that Europe is defenseless? Because if that belief is sincere, if it reflects not just Trump's negotiating posture, but the actual strategic assessment of the American administration, then it has enormous implications for how the United States would respond in the event of a real crisis. The Article 5 Mutual Defense Guarantee, the heart of NATO, the commitment that an attack on one member is an attack on all, has always rested on the assumption that the United States would fulfill that commitment if tested. It has never actually been tested in a full military sense. Its power as a deterrent comes entirely from its credibility, from the belief held by both allies and adversaries that Washington would follow through. When the vice president publicly declares Europe defenseless, he is not just making an observation. He is, whether he intends to or not, planting a seed of doubt about American resolve that adversaries will water and grow in the days and weeks ahead. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, that implication is not being discussed in the abstract. It is being discussed as an operational reality that changes threat calculations immediately. Here is a dimension of this story that is getting less attention than it deserves, and it matters enormously for understanding what comes next. JD Vance's declaration has not produced a unified American political response. It has produced a split, a sharp, visible fracture between the Trump administration's position and a significant portion of the American foreign policy and defense establishment, including voices within the Republican Party itself. Several senior Republican senators, figures with long records of hawkish foreign policy and deep institutional ties to the military and intelligence communities, have gone on record with statements that amount to a direct contradiction of Vance's framing. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, issued a statement emphasizing the importance of the transatlantic alliance and the genuine military capabilities of European partners. He did not name Vance directly, but in Washington, everyone who read that statement understood exactly who it was directed at. Former senior military officials who served under multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have been even more direct in their public assessments. Retired Admiral James Stavridis, who served as NATO's supreme allied commander, described Vance's remarks as dangerously inaccurate and warned that statements of this kind have a direct and measurable effect on deterrence because adversaries hear them and factor them into their strategic calculations. That is not a political statement from a partisan figure. That is a warning from someone who spent years at the operational center of the alliance Vance just called irrelevant. What this split reveals is that the Trump administration's confrontational posture toward NATO is not simply a negotiating tactic that the American foreign policy establishment has quietly accepted. There is genuine, serious, substantive disagreement inside the American system, and that disagreement is now breaking into the open in ways that make the administration's position look less like policy and more like a faction. Predictably and ominously, Moscow has reacted to Vance's declaration with something that can only be described as barely contained delight. Russian state media ran the remarks extensively and approvingly, framing them as an authoritative American confirmation of what the Kremlin has been arguing for years, that NATO is a hollow alliance, that European military capacity is a fiction, and that the security architecture the West has built against Russia is fundamentally weak. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, in his daily press briefing, declined to comment directly, a studied silence that, in the context of how openly Russian state media was celebrating, communicated everything without requiring a word. More concerning than the propaganda response is what Russian military planners are almost certainly doing right now with Vance's statement. Military planning is driven by capability assessments and intention signals. When the Vice President of the United States publicly signals, whether intentionally or not, that American confidence in European defense capability is low, it changes the risk calculus for any adversary considering a move that might test that capability. It does not guarantee aggression, but it reduces the perceived cost of probing behavior, the kind of incremental testing of boundaries that, historically, tends to precede larger crises. NATO's eastern members, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, understand this dynamic at a level that is not intellectual, but lived. They have requested emergency consultations with both NATO command and their bilateral American military contacts. They are seeking reassurance that Vance's public declaration does not reflect a change in operational American commitments, that American forces stationed on their soil are still there under the same terms, with the same guarantees, backed by the same chain of command it has always been. Those reassurances are being provided. But the fact that they need to be provided at all is itself a measure of how much damage a single word from a single official can do to the foundations of collective security. Europe is not waiting to see how Washington resolves its internal debate. Europe is moving, and it is moving in directions that, a year ago, would have seemed politically impossible. The concept of European strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should build independent military capability and decision-making capacity that does not rely on American leadership, has been discussed for decades, mostly as a theoretical aspiration that collided with the political reality of alliance dependence. Tonight, that concept is no longer theoretical. It is policy. Multiple senior European officials have confirmed that accelerated discussions around a European defense framework, one that could operate independently of NATO structures if necessary, are now moving from the planning stage to the implementation stage. France, which has pushed longest and hardest for European strategic autonomy, is positioning itself as the leader of this shift. President Macron is expected to make a major address in the coming days, laying out a French-led proposal for an independent European defense initiative, one that would pool European military resources, accelerate joint procurement of advanced weapon systems, and begin the politically sensitive discussion of how French nuclear deterrence might be extended to cover European partners. That last element, the nuclear question, represents a shift of historic magnitude, one that reflects just how seriously European leaders are taking the possibility that American guarantees can no longer be considered unconditional. Germany has announced an emergency review of its defense investment program, with sources indicating that Berlin is prepared to consider spending levels well beyond even the new NATO guidelines, not because Washington demanded it, but because Germany has concluded that its own security requires it regardless of what Washington does or says. Poland has called for an emergency European defense summit. The Baltic states are in direct contact with Nordic and Scandinavian partners about bilateral security arrangements that would function as a regional safety net independent of broader alliance structures. All of this is happening at extraordinary speed, and it is all happening because one man, in one statement, used one word that changed the conversation permanently. There is a version of this story in which JD Vance's declaration ultimately produces something useful, in which the shock of being called defenseless finally drives European nations to invest in genuine independent military capability, and in which a stronger, more self-reliant Europe emerges from this crisis as a more capable partner rather than a more dependent one. That version is possible. It is not guaranteed, and it comes with an enormous amount of risk in the gap between where Europe is now and where it would need to be to make that version real. What is not in dispute is what tonight represents. It represents a moment when the language of the transatlantic alliance changed in a way that cannot be walked back. Words matter in diplomacy precisely because they are signals of intent, of assessment, of commitment. When the Vice President of the United States signals publicly that he views Europe as defenseless, every actor on the global stage, allies, adversaries, neutral nations, watching to see which way the wind blows, updates their model of American intentions accordingly. That update has already happened. It cannot be undone by a clarification or a follow-up statement or a carefully worded diplomatic cable. The architecture of Western security was built on trust, on the belief that the words spoken by American leaders meant something, that the commitments made by Washington were real, and that the alliance would hold under pressure. Tonight, that architecture has a crack in it that was not there yesterday. Whether it widens into a fracture or gets sealed before it does irreparable damage depends on decisions that have not yet been made by leaders who are right now choosing their next move in one of the most consequential geopolitical moments of the past half century. This story is not slowing down. It is accelerating. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and do not step away, because the next development in this crisis could arrive before you finish reading this, and when it does, you need to be ready.